All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you could just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We will have the book signed, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. So this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Dr. Stephen Heine, presenting his new book, Zen Koans. Dr. Heine is professor of religious studies and history and director of Asian studies at Florida International University. He earned his doctorate from Temple University. Among his many accomplishments, he has received fellowships and grants from Fulbright, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Japan Foundation, the Association for Asian Studies, the U.S. Department of Education, and the American Academy of Religion. He is the author of more than 24 books, including Dogen and the Koan Tradition, Shifting Shape, Shifting Text, Opening a Mountain, and Zen Skin, Zen Marrow. And we have some of Dr. Heine's backlist titles for sale at the counter as well, by the way. In this book, Dr. Heine, who has written extensively on Zen Buddhism and koans, introduces and analyzes the classic background of texts and rites, and explores the contemporary significance of koans to illuminate the full implications of this ongoing tradition. He delves deeply into the inner structure of koan literature to uncover and interpret profound levels of metaphorical significance. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Stephen Heine.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and I'm always happy to have a chance to come to the wonderful bookstore, Books and Books. And for those of you, I'll be referring to this handout, so please grab a copy if one's available. We have a couple more in the back if anybody needs one. Yeah, and in the introduction, a few years ago, I guess my bio said more than 20 books, and then when it became 24, it was supposed to say more than 24 books, but there was a typo, so somebody once introduced me as having more than 20 dozen books. So I don't think I'll get to that point yet, but anyway, it's great to be surrounded by such a wonderful array of books at Books and Books. Okay, Zen Koans. Zen koans are a very mysterious item, but have become very popular. It's about a 1,000-year-old tradition stemming from China and Japan. And what is a Zen Buddhist koan? A Zen Buddhist koan can be defined as a paradoxical saying. So let me give a couple of examples. Some of you have heard of some of these examples. What is the sound of one hand clapping is probably the single most famous example. If all things have Buddha nature, if all things are Buddha in their essence, what about a dog? Does a dog have Buddha nature? And why did the first teacher of Zen come from the West, come from India to visit China? The cypress tree in the garden is the answer. And then another one, which I'll be talking about in more detail, is what is the look on your face before you were born? Which is also referred to, what is your original face? Now, all those examples are what I would say paradoxical, and they don't seem to have a clear and easy explanation or solution, and they're not supposed to. The idea of the paradox is to kind of defy the imagination, to disturb and disrupt your ordinary way of thinking, to move you out of your comfort zone. Some people say that koans are riddles or puzzles, as if there was kind of a secret answer to it all. And there may be some examples where that's kind of true. But a lot of times the teachers of the koans will say, don't try to figure out a specific answer. You have to experience it on a different level of insight and intuition rather than logical thinking or rational analysis of it. Now, sometimes koans are not necessarily paradoxical. By paradox, I mean a contradiction or something that simply doesn't make sense from an ordinary standpoint. But sometimes they go in a different direction. Flowers are red, the willow trees are green. My nose is vertical, my eyes are horizontal. Those are also koans. So those are very simple affirmations, or those are simple examples where the teaching is kind of repetitive and just giving you a simple explanation. So those can also be considered koans. And they have the same point of forcing you to stop thinking on the ordinary level and move you into a different direction. Now, what is this different direction that koans move us to? This is what I try to bring out in the book. And let's take a look at the handout. In the middle of the front page, there's 3 illustrations. 2 are from a Japanese book, and one is just a photo I got off the internet. That I'll explain that in a moment. But let's look on the left side, and you see on the bottom of that left illustration, on the bottom part of it, there's 3 sets of figures. There's a Buddha that's kind of on a pedestal, and then to the right of the Buddha there's a teacher, and then at the bottom of that section there are several disciples. So there's kind of 3 levels. The disciples who want to become a Buddha, they need the teacher to instruct them and guide them on that pathway. Now, so how do you make that transition? That's what Zen Buddhism and all forms of Buddhism, and in a sense other kinds of religion as well, using different terminology, are about. So the illustrations just above that give 2 examples. The one in the middle there is what's called in Japan other power. And other power means you can't really save yourself. You can't really get enlightenment through your own efforts because, in Western terminology, we would say you're a sinner. And they do use that term in Buddhism as well. But you have bad karma, you've transgressed, you're ignorant, you're attached, you can't overcome your own deficiencies. So only the saving grace of the Buddha. It sounds very Western, very Christian, but that is a main teaching of the other power school in Japan, also known as the Pure Land school. The Zen school is known as self-power. So self-power, you can do it yourself through your own concentration, meditation, your own effort and discipline and training. You can get there. But if you look at those pictures carefully, both the other power picture in the middle and the Zen self-power picture at the top have the arrows going in both directions. So even if you use self-power, there is the influence or impact from forces outside of you. It can be the teacher, it can be some other context or surroundings, it can be the natural environment, it can be the beauty of nature, it can be some other kind of inspirational force. So you never just do it on your own. No person is an island, according to that teaching. Even though it's self-power, self-power doesn't mean that you ignore the holistic surrounding. In fact, the idea is to become harmonious with the holistic surrounding. But before you can become harmonious, you have to experience bewilderment. So when I was Googling the Japanese term konwaku for bewilderment or being perplexed or confused, one of the images that came up was this signpost. And this is actually a useful experience according to Zen Buddhism, and maybe in other religions as well. You have to go through uncertainty on a profound level. You have to have doubt. You have to doubt everything. You have to doubt yourself, doubt everything around you in order to have a turnabout and make the progression into the standpoint of some kind of self-realization or enlightenment. You can't do it without first getting all your signals disoriented and reoriented and turned around and turned topsy-turvy and upside down. And that's partly what the koans are trying to do, is to get you out of the comfort zone, disturb and disrupt your ordinary way of thinking, and force you to think about it on a different level. So in the illustration on the right, you see the 2 monks at the bottom there, and those are 2 styles of meditation. One person is facing the wall, so they won't be distracted by anybody else around them. That's one style in one of the Zen schools. And in the other school, the person is facing straight ahead. And there would be people lined up on the other side of the room looking at them. And that each side justifies their view. One has no distraction. One, you face the distraction, but then you have to use the discipline to overcome the distraction. And there's a lot of debate about that. But in any case, what they want to do is ask you to meditate on the koans. What you're doing during the meditation experience is contemplating the significance of the koans. And you see on the top of that illustration, there's a monk standing next to a bell that's ringing, or a chime that's ringing. And this is an interesting symbol because, as I said, self-power also involves stimulation from outside of yourself. And that could be the beauty of nature. Flowers are red, willows are green. Or it could be the sound of the bell. It could be the sound of the birds. It could be, there's a famous story of a monk who was sweeping up and a pebble hit the bamboo tree and it made a clinking sound. There's stories of hearing frogs croaking or dogs barking. The stimulation, the breakthrough can come from any direction. The chime of a bell is interesting because it's a very deep, resounding sound that has the Japanese big bronze Buddhist bells have a deep echo. And so it makes a kind of overwhelming sound for a few seconds, and then it kind of evaporates or dissolves into silence. And that has an interesting symbolism. Okay, so to explain a couple other ideas on this front page here, let's look at the table at the bottom of the page. There won't be a quiz, so you don't have to memorize. But here is a table that I use in the book to show the history of the Koan tradition. And it goes through different stages connected with Chinese and Japanese history, starting around 1000. So it's about 1,000 years old, and going through the classical period, medieval period, early modern period, and so forth. And I just point that out to show that even though these are paradoxical sayings that seemingly nonsensical, a lot of time was spent polishing, developing, cultivating, commenting, criticizing, revising, and developing this tradition in literature. There's volumes and volumes of it. Fortunately, today a lot of that is digitized, and we can download it on the internet now in Chinese and Japanese. And there's, you know, if you looked at the Koan tradition, it would fill many encyclopedia-sized volumes. There's a saying that nobody talks more than mystics in any religion who tell you to be silent. And they say the language doesn't really help you get enlightened, but they talk endlessly about it. And so that's one of the interesting things to me. In my many years of studies of koans, to tell you the truth, I went through a period in my life where I didn't like koans very much because I thought, hey, you know, what sense does this make? I liked other things of Zen Buddhism. I liked the serenity, the minimalism, the simplicity of the lifestyle, the Zen Buddhist gardens, calligraphy, tea ceremony. All of that I thought was great. But when it came to the koans, I thought, well, okay, you know, you've seen one koan, you've seen them all. What's going on? So the first chapter, or the preface of the book, is called "The Koan is My Koan," because to me it was a koan to deal with this for many years till I started to see that I had to go through the doubt myself. I had to break through this, what they call the great doubt block in my own mind, and understand the depth of it beyond what hits you on the surface level. And what hits you on the surface level is designed to throw you off course and designed to make you confused. And it took me a long time. I also want to say that I'm not necessarily an advocate that the koan tradition has all the answers in the world. One of my students a couple of years ago showed me how to download a koan app on my iPhone, and I don't consult it, and partly because when I do consult it, it's never really a koan. They just pick a saying by Confucius or something, and they throw that in there. But also, I realize, like any kind of disclaimer here, is that like any religious institution, religious tradition, and any aspect of human society, there's ups and downs of Zen Buddhism. So I think there's a lot of beauty and depth and profundity to it. However, in the last chapter of the book, I have a section called "The Good, Bad, and the Ugly of Zen Buddhism." Zen Buddhism has been known to help propagate discrimination against outcasts in Japan. It's known for examples of sexual harassment. It's known for being kind of too withdrawn from society. It's known for being very authoritarian because the Zen teacher, since there's no real easy solution to these koans, and there's no necessarily right or wrong, Zen teacher has the authority to to discipline people any way they see fit. And many times, there's examples where they say that that privilege has been abused. And so the Zen institution has its own ups and downs. There's been scandals. Zen Buddhism in America has had its scandals, and Buddhism in Japan and Korea and China have all had scandals. But that's true of any of the institutions, and we have to take into account that they're part of human society, and nothing is totally pure above the fray. But I do think that Zen Buddhism offers a very interesting way to achieve transcendence. So if we look at that little table at the top of the page, 3 words starting with the prefix trans: transcendence, transformation, and transmission. So this is what I want to talk mainly about, and the idea is that transmission and transformation form the core of transcendence. So by transcendence, I mean there's an enlightenment experience. There's a realization. There's a level that you can attain that overcomes the ignorance and attachments, ideally, through working on the discipline of Zen Koans. That transcendence has 2 aspects. One aspect is very individualistic. That's transformation. It's very personal. Only you can understand it for yourself. That's the self-power. Nobody can hand it to you. It's not part of a curriculum necessarily, although you do study the koans in a planned and organized way. But it's not a result of adding up 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a matter of insight, of a breakthrough, of an illumination. It may be sudden. It may be slow. It may take time. Many people struggle with it. There's many stories in the history of Zen Buddhism where the people who became the most famous monks and masters in the tradition got ill from it. They talk about the Zen illness because it can cause anxiety, and that can lead to physical symptoms. They didn't have a definition of what we would call nervous breakdown in the past, but what many people describe in going back to 1000, the years 1000, 1200 in the medieval period, was along those lines, that that the doubt became so profound that they were very insecure and unstable, and they had to go through that. And so that adds to the allure of it to some extent, because some of those stories are very dramatic, but it also highlights the point that the transformation is only for the individual who wants to persist and go through the path. However, there is also a communal aspect of it. As many of you know, Asian society is very communal oriented, and religious traditions in general have to have a religious hierarchy. They have to have the leaders and the followers, and to become a leader you have to go through training no matter what the religion is, and usually you have to study writings and texts, so whether it's biblical commentaries or whether it's the writings associated with Zen Buddhism. And that's what I mean by transmission. So in transmission, the idea is that a teacher is looking for one and only one thing. And what would that be? Just to ask a question here for a moment. What's the one thing that all teachers want? Especially in the Eastern traditions. Silence is good, because this is Zen Buddhism.
For their students to surpass the teacher?
For the student, right? They want the student who can surpass them. And will go down in history as outdoing them. That's what they're looking for, and that's what's known as transmission. Now, according to the legends, back in the medieval times, each generation produced one great master. That kind of limits it. It's going to be a small tradition if there's only one per generation. So then they had a lot of different schools and lineages and streams and houses. They gave different names for the different schools of thought. And so each generation in that school of thought could have one transmission. Or as time went by, they had multiple transmissions and a kind of multi-branched family tree, so to speak, because they thought of themselves as a family. They used that kind of Confucian metaphor to explain how the transmission process worked. And transmission's crucial to it. You can't just be an individual enlightenment unless you're passing it on, unless you're receiving it and passing it on to somebody else. There are hermits and recluses, and people go off to the mountaintop, and they're celebrated. A couple of the fascinating stories to me in Zen Buddhism are the bird's nest monk. The bird's nest monk, they say, lived in a bird's nest in the tree and meditated for many years, never came down. And the great poets and intellectuals of the time would go up to him and, teach us. and he'd give them some koan. They had no idea what it meant, and they'd walk off. And then there was the boat monk. The boat monk floated in a boat for 30 years and never left the boat. And one great student was advised by his teacher, go and find the boat monk. And he found the boat monk taught him, and then the boat monk said, I'm transmitting to you, goodbye, jumped off the boat, never to be heard from again. Now these stories are mythologized, of course, quite a bit, but the grain of truth in the mythology is that you have to find your disciple. You have to find your protege. You have to be able to pass it on. Okay, let me turn to Western religions for a moment, because I think Zen Buddhism has its unique features, but it's also a typical example that rings a bell with other religions. So in the West, we also have paradoxes. God created something out of nothing, right? Okay, there's my, I see my disciple coming. Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. These are contradictory kinds of sayings. The first will be last, the last will be first. Eternity is in a blade of grass or a grain of sand. So those kinds of teachings are also somewhat paradoxical. Just today, in doing some research, I ran into the saying from the Gospel of Mark, he who has will gain more. He who does not have will be taken away from, will lose more. And that's an interesting saying, very paradoxical in itself. And then you realize, hey, that's been interpreted in paradoxical ways, because some people criticize that saying and says it's kind of like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and it enforces inequality. And then some people praise it because what they say is that the spiritual meaning is that if you have knowledge and depth of understanding, you're always enriching it. And if you don't have the knowledge, you have nothing to work with to enrich it. And there's a Zen Buddhist saying very similar. It says, like the master says, if you're going off on a journey, do you have a travel bag? And the disciple says, yes, I have a travel bag. And the master says, here, I'll give you another one. And then he asks another disciple. The disciple says, no, I don't have a travel bag. And then the master says, well, I'm going to take away whatever you don't have from you. So very similar to the biblical saying. And in the Western traditions, there's also that sense of simple affirmation sometimes. There was a famous medieval Christian mystic who said, the flower blooms, why? It blooms just because it blooms. It doesn't ask why, so why should we ask why the flower blooms? It just is beautiful in and of itself. Very similar to the Zen saying, flowers are red, willows are green. So there's correspondences here. And I think one of the things that's important to realize that in religious teachings, East and West, in addition to the word paradox, there's another P word that's very important, which is parable. So parable and paradox both refer to a kind of indirect method of teaching, because the spiritual truth cannot be given in a piece of paper. It cannot be something that's memorized. It has to be a matter of insight, intuition, realization. And so parable and paradox are two techniques to force you into that new way of thinking. Now, what's the difference? I think generally we would say that a parable is a little more, even though it's indirect and it's kind of mysterious and you have to read between the lines, it's a little bit more straightforward than a paradox, because there's a message that is understandable when you read between the lines of the story. But what I've come to think of in my many studies of the Zen Buddhist koans over the years, and for this book I was asked by the publisher, University of Hawaii Press, to try to write a book that would, not so much for the scholars and the researchers, but that could be used in the classroom as a textbook more, to kind of boil it down and give the essence of it in a couple hundred pages. What I've come to think over the years is that most of what seems very paradoxical and nonsensical actually has a parable side if you look at it. Now, how do you look at it? Well, what happens is, I think that when you're studying it carefully, you see there's a context to a lot of these paradoxical sayings. And that context was well known to people in the tradition in medieval times, because they were immersed in it. And they didn't always have to refer to the context because they knew it, and they could take for granted. So they could say things very succinctly and very cryptically to each other because they knew what it referred to. They knew the allusions and citations and references that were in the background. But when it comes down to modern times, we kind of, all we hear is the paradoxical sayings without necessarily looking at the context, and then they just seem mysterious in and of themselves. And that mystique, some people want to emphasize, and it has its own merit, it has its own valuable quality, but I think that there is more to it than just paradox for its own sake. I think that there is this message or metaphor behind the story. So what I'd like to do in the remaining part is to use the main example from the flip side of the page here to talk about the relation between the paradox and the parable. So let me give a simple example, and then this is a little more complicated example. The simple example is one I cited at the beginning. Why did the first teacher come from India, come from the West to China? And the answer was the cypress tree in the garden. Well, when you first look at it, you figure, well, that doesn't make any sense, but maybe that's the point. So it doesn't make any sense, and that's the sense that it doesn't, that it makes because it doesn't make sense. And maybe you can stop there. And a lot of people will interpret it and give a reading along those lines. But, if you look at the context, then a couple things come out very quickly. The monk who said that, well, he lived in a temple, and guess what? That temple that he lived in was called Cypress Tree Temple, which still exists in China. It's a couple hours by train south of Beijing. It's been revived. It was destroyed over the years, and in the Cultural Revolution, it was wiped out totally. But it's been revived since the 1980s. Very interesting place to visit. And the reason it's called Cypress Tree Temple is because that's an area where cypress trees are very popular, and they fill up the landscape in that area. So when he's saying cypress tree in the courtyard or in the garden, probably he's saying, hey, what is the essence of the teaching? Why did the guy come here to teach it? Well, just to show us what's right in front of your eyes, which is the beauty of nature, which is to practice your meditation right here in front of you. Don't get distracted by too many high-minded ideas, and all of a sudden it starts to become pretty clear. Also, the cypress tree is an image that's used in Chinese culture and literature very often because it represents longevity in nature, persistence, and when you translate that into human qualities, dedication and determination. And so the first patriarch who risked everything to leave India to come to China, and he took a lot of challenges on, and he made this his mission. He resembles a cypress tree because everybody would know what that means. That, hey, he's a venerable, respectable figure who's made it his goal to convey to us the teaching. So the cypress tree in the courtyard has this context, and all of a sudden it starts to make sense. Now, if you go back and look at the commentaries, they'll say, well, don't get too hung up on what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. But I think that you don't want to overemphasize that because they were saying that to people that knew the context. And when you say that to people that don't know the context and they take that as a license, well, we don't have to deal with the context, I think that's misleading. So let's bring out the context in this case, which is focusing on the another one I mentioned at the beginning. What is the look on your face before you were born, or what is your original face? Which is mentioned, if you look on that flip side of the page under number 2. The sixth patriarch said, not thinking of good and not thinking of evil at this very moment, what is the original face? Okay, so original face, again, seems kind of nonsensical. Now, maybe you say, all right, we're all pure before we come into a corrupt world. If you see a baby at childbirth, sometimes they're crying and screaming, and sometimes they're very serene and have a kind of Buddha-like look on their face. And maybe you're trying to go back and capture that face that that was on your the expression that was on your face before you had to think about right and wrong and good and evil and life and death, and things got very complicated. And okay, that makes sense out of the nonsensical, but there's a lot more to it according to this koan. If you look at the entire story, the narrative behind it. Now I'm dividing it up. You can see into 6 sections. And it doesn't quite follow them in the 1, 2, 3 sequence according to my labeling, but the point of 1, 2, and 3, doubt, experience, expression, that is the transformation side. That's the individual experience. And 4, 5, and 6, which again are a little bit out of order, but that refers to the transmission side of the community, of the hierarchy, of passing on the teaching to a disciple. And this particular story is very interesting because it's got it all wrapped up in it's still a very, very short story. It's kind of spread out here. It takes up about a third of a page, but it's got all these elements packed into it if you take a closer look at it. Now, this story involves what's known as the sixth patriarch, Heine. So, Heine was the guy who was a sixth generation after the first patriarch came from India to China. And he's kind of the key to the spread of the whole tradition. And according to the biographical accounts, as much as we see it for Heine, he was supposed to have been kind of a illiterate, untrained, unschooled person who came from the southern area of China known as Lingnan. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, but Lingnan was a place in southern China that we might compare to the Bayou in America. It was kind of a swampy place way down at the southern edge of the country, where there were a lot of tropical diseases, where it was very exotic and beautiful sometimes, but you didn't really want to travel there. You didn't want to get, you might travel there, but you didn't really want to get stuck living there. And you certainly didn't want to come from there. And anybody who came from there and they went up north to the more civilized, educated, sophisticated places, they were immediately going to be put down. And then you add to it that he's illiterate. So how does he become the sixth patriarch? Well, that's the whole point. It's kind of a rag to riches legend here. And that's, it kind of builds up this dramatic mythology by talking about how he's going to come and outsmart all the educated monks and eventually become the leader who gains the transmission. So they had a contest. It was a poetry contest, and when the fifth patriarch was nearing his death, and they said that those masters could foresee the time of their death, and they knew it was coming, and they had to pick the disciple. So he had a poetry contest, and you put up on the board your poem, and then he would select the best one, and that would become the sixth patriarch. Well, this guy's illiterate, so he can't write his poem. He can think it, he can compose it, but he can't write it down. So he gets a friend of his to sneak in and write it, and he's there. And lo and behold, the fifth patriarch picks this guy. Well, the one who gets passed over, Ming, in this story, a monk named Ming, who was one of the who had been a former general who had become one of the head monks in the system. Poor Ming here, he gets very upset. He doesn't like this business at all. And so he makes it known that he's going to hunt down Heine. And so Heine is encouraged by the fifth patriarch, hey, you better take off here because they're going to come after you. And before you take off, I'm going to give you my robe. The robe is the single main symbol of the transmission. Now, robe has a lot of symbolism in Buddhism, and there's basically two kinds of robes. One is what they call the patch robe, which is where you pick up rags because you don't want to show off, you don't want to be egotistical, you don't want to have beautiful possessions. So you pick up rags, and even you go to the cemetery and you pick up dusty rags and you piece them together, and that's your robe. But at the same time, the great teachers and masters were admired by the emperors, and they would want to give them a beautiful silk robe to wear. And so that became a tradition as well. And so we can assume that this is one of these beautiful robes that's an exquisite possession, and Heine, the illiterate guy from the Bayou, he is now in possession of it. Ming is chasing him into the peak. Seeing Ming approaching, the Heine put the robe and his begging bowl on a rock and said, this robe represents the teaching. This robe represents the faith. Can it really become the subject of a contest? Go ahead and take it away. Okay, so that's a great, teaching of this master. He's not going to be attached to it. You want it? Fine, take it. And this contest, this interaction, let me skip down here. So that was, we covered number 5 at the top. Let me skip down to number 1, doubt. This causes tremendous doubt in Ming. Okay, all of a sudden he's caught short by fear and trembling. You know, interesting phrase here, because one of the great books of modern Christian philosophy by Soren Kierkegaard is called Fear and Trembling, and it talks just about that point. Like, you know, to maintain your faith, you have to undergo this doubt, and a very similar concept here. And he says, because of his doubt, he's filled with perspiration. Has anxiety. His heart's probably fluttering, and he says, "Enlighten me." Now, why does he have this doubt? Well, let's go back to number 4, mythology. He tried to pick up the robe, but it was immovable as a mountain. Now, probably did that happen? Well, we could stretch our imagination to imagine everything else is happening so far. The illiterate monk has got the robe. He throws down the robe. All right, take it if you want it. Is it immovable as a mountain? Then we're getting into, Alice in Wonderland. We're getting into Wizard of Oz, Harry Potter territory there. But that bit of mythology is essential to make the story work. And that's part of the context. And I don't think we can just throw that away and just simply say it's symbolic, in the sense that probably back then they would take this very seriously. They would believe this kind of legend and myth. But in any case, Ming knows he's challenged. Whether he actually can't pick up the robe, or whether that just means, hey, look, I know I'm deficient, so I can't just claim a robe and become master, because this guy, by being willing to give up the robe, obviously knows a lot more than I do in terms of attaining realization. So now we go down to number 2. After the doubt, then he has the experience. And the experience comes by saying, what is the look on your original face? Well, Ming was now totally drenched in sweat, because he doesn't have an answer for it. But he knows the meaning of it. The meaning of it is, let's go back before you were general, before you got in contest, before you had adversaries and opponents, and let's go back to your pure thought, because if you can capture that, then you deserve the robe. If you can't capture that, you can have the robe all you want to, it's not going to do you any good. So then we go to number 3, expression. Well, once you have the experience, you got to put it into words one way or another. And Ming wept, and he said, well, give me the secret words and the secret meanings. What else is there? There's got to be something more to it. And Huineng says, it's not a secret, it's not a mystery, there's nothing else to it, because it is your original face, which is that you either deserve this robe or not. It's not something beyond this particular moment. At this moment, you're exposed. Your true integrity and character, or lack of it, are exposed. Let's see it or not see it. So then we go to, let's go back up to number 5, monasticism. So in other words, we're almost at the end of the trail here. We've gone through doubt, experience, and expression. He's had his personal transformation. Now we're in the process of the succession. Can Ming come back in the fold? Can Ming now be considered part of the teaching? Can he become a follower of Huineng, or will he become a rogue? Will he have to go off on his own? Is he going to be dismissed? Well, religious traditions, and I think Zen Buddhism is no exception, they have their harsh critical side and set a high bar and set a strict standard, so it's going to exclude many people, or they want to be inclusive and bring people back in and try to expand the teaching to encompass as many people as possible. So this is a critical decision Huineng has to make. Has Ming lost it totally, or can we rehabilitate this guy? So let's go down to number 6 then, succession. Ming said, I practiced in the assembly under Huangmei, that was the 5th patriarch, for many years, but I was not able to realize my original face. Now, with your instruction, I am like someone who drinks water and knows for himself whether it is cool or warm. Okay, that's it in a nutshell. If you drink the water, you drink the Kool-Aid, as we say today, You know for yourself. I can say it's cold, and it is or it isn't based on you. That's where it's completely individual. Not that everything's relative. Not that something ice cold you can say is boiling hot and it's going to make any sense. But the simple but important point is that the judgments have to be made on your own. Nobody can teach you that level of judgment. It's very simple. So you deserve the robe or you don't deserve the robe. Now I feel, he says, like someone who drinks water and knows for himself whether it is cool or warm. Powerful master, you are my teacher. And he says, I'm willing to kowtow to you now. I chased you. I was your rival. I was your enemy. I wanted to shoot you down, so to speak, but now you're my teacher. But that's still going to be a little bit artificial, and that's still a little bit superficial. So Huineng says to him, we both have the fifth patriarch as our teacher. Take care in preserving what you've attained. In other words, for Huineng to prove himself to be the true master, he can not only bring Ming back into the fold, but he can treat him in an egalitarian way. He can treat him as part of the progression, not put him in his place, not keep him in a limited way. So, to sum up, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments, the point I'm trying to make in this book is to show the context behind the text. We have the text, we have these koans as bits of writing, and with a lot of commentaries that would fill up volumes. And people study them, they memorize them, they make apps for the iPhone with them. They do all kinds of things with them, and a lot of times they say, don't try to interpret it, just think for yourself. And to some extent, I agree with that point. But at the same time, if you pull off the shelf those books and read through them, unfortunately, most of them have not been translated, but there's a lot of translations that are available now, and some of them are pretty good ones. And if you can pour through some of that, or a lot of that, or see the whole context build up, you realize, hey, that the paradox has a parable side. It's teaching a message. The message is you have to combine your personal transformation with the success of your lineage, of your school of thought, of the group that you're a part of, and bring everybody up. All boats going higher lift each other up, and that's the context in which these little bits of text are wrapped up, and we can try to unravel that. So that's my thought for today. So thank you. And any questions? Yes.
I understand that koans are specifically related to the Japanese culture or Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
Right. Is there anything that's similar to koans or paradoxes in other cultures as well?
Yeah.
One that came to mind was perhaps ancient Greece. I forget the. Let's say, for example, Plato, the story of
the cave.
The cave.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes. No, I think, and I was mentioning earlier. Also, there's some biblical sayings, Alpha and Omega. God creates something out of nothing. I think there's a lot of examples. Greek philosophy. There was the famous early Greek philosopher before Plato, Heraclitus, who said, when you step in the stream, you're never stepping in the same water because it's flowing by. That's very Zen-like. The cave metaphor is very Zen-like. Socrates said, "Know thyself." That's also when I say Zen-like, I don't mean that Zen, that they're trying to equal Zen, but each in its own way has that. I think so it is a common ingredient, and of course parables exist in many different traditions, and so it's not one-sided. I don't want to pick Zen out, but then another question would be, well, okay, why bother with Zen if you can find that elsewhere? And my philosophy on that would be, well, look, people look in all kinds of direction. Whatever clicks, clicks. So there's all kinds of styles, and there's all kinds of standpoints, and you pursue the one that is suited to you, and the more the merrier in terms of the availability of different teaching systems, and people will find it. And within Zen, there are very heated debates. as we saw in the diagram, some people face the wall, some people face here, and they will debate that very furiously sometimes to get all hung up in that point. But I think underlying it, there's the human nature, which is, yes, the paradoxes, parables, that teaching emphasizing self-understanding, self-knowledge, self-realization does have a universal quality. I guess now to make a comment again, this time a little bit more in favor of Zen being a little bit more unique than some of the others is that Zen says things like, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Zen has teachers that say, here's the scriptures, and they rip them up, or they throw them into the fire. Or in a cold night, they'll take the statue of the Buddha and make firewood out of it. So that irreverence, that kind of blasphemy, which is mostly kind of tongue-in-cheek, it's not really intended to be disrespectful, because it is a very respectful society, and you do have to observe the hierarchy. But that willingness to throw everything out the window, so to speak, just for the sake of the self-realization, I think has a little bit different flavor. It goes a little bit further than some of the other traditions. And I think that's the appeal in today's world. So in today's world, which is kind of universalistic, because we know so much about world history, much more than previous generations, and also very self-individual oriented in modern secular industrial society. We're kind of focused on individual accomplishment. I think Zen, coming from 1,000 years ago, foreshadowed a lot of that, and that's why it has a popularity today. But we also see yoga and many other forms of Eastern teaching and meditation popular. But most of them have that individualistic quality, and so the ideology is kind of secondary. The ideology, the theology. There was some of you may know Joseph Campbell, who was a very famous historian of world religions, and he wrote a lot of books about comparative mythology, and he told a story that one time he went to a conference with experts on world religions that happened to be held in Japan this time, and he went to the conference in Japan, and they said to the Japanese teachers, well, what's your ideology? What's your theology? I see people meditating, I see people doing these practices, but what is? Give it to me in a nutshell beyond that. And then the teacher said, there is no theology, there is no ideology. We just do it. And I think that, that flavor is what has a resonance today. Yeah.
This is kind of a simplistic question. As you did your research for this, you find yourself drawn to one collection or another, say the Mumonkan or the Hekigan or
Yes. Yes, and for those of you who don't know, Bill Wilson is a very profound translator of many Japanese and Chinese writings also. And I also promised Maria Sol, the Asian Studies coordinator, who gets a call out in the preface to the book because she helped edit. She does a lot of great things at FIU for Asian Studies, and I'm very grateful to her. So anyway, yes, I did. Now, when I've talked to people in different areas, and sometimes I don't consider myself a Zen practitioner in the sense that a lot of Americans do, but I go and sometimes give lectures to those groups, and I get the comment from people who've been studying a lot of the stuff in the translation. They said, oh, all the stuff's been translated already. We don't need to. And that I would say 1% of 1% of 1% has been translated already. And a lot of that has been translated several times. Like you said, Mumonkan, better known as Gateless Gate in most English translations. And there's a lot of, there's probably a dozen translations of that available. And most of those are pretty good, and you can pick one up and they're useful. But then there's so many that haven't been translated. But another one you mentioned, Hekigan Loku, known in English as Blue Cliff Record. And that was created in China in 1100. And then, in fact, the follower of the guy who created it got so upset that it was had such elaborate rhetoric and literary flourish and a discursive flair to it that, according to the history that we don't know for sure, but according to the history that we read, his disciple, he actually took it and destroyed it, and not only destroyed the Hekigan Loku, but China had early printing presses in the 1100s, so he went and he got the wood block that they used it to print from and burned that, they said. And then he went around the country and found out all the copies he could find, and he got all of them. And you're like, what the heck was he doing? And he said, no, people are going to get hung up on the words. If they follow this text, they're going to memorize, they're going to get the cliches, they're going to get interpretations, and it's too much, and it's distracting people. Now, it's a very complicated story, and I get reminded of a story that's in a very different context. If you're familiar with modern Western literature, we have somebody like James Joyce, right, who writes Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, these books, 600 pages, and so many allusions, and you can read a couple sentences of that, and he might use different, he makes puns in 5 or 6 different languages. He refers to all these kinds of literatures and mythologies. And then his disciple, who took notes for him when he was writing Finnegan's Wake, Samuel Beckett, who became famous for writing for Waiting for Godot, said, to heck with it. Nobody can do what James Joyce did. I can't imitate him. So I'm going to write very simplistic, sparse, minimal dialogue in my play Waiting for Godot. And I just heard the story. Some of you old-timers in Miami may know the story. Where did Waiting for Godot open in America? Where was the first place where they... What's that? Coconut Grove Playhouse. And from what I understand, that was before Broadway. Now, it had a mixed record in Europe because, it's very hard for people to understand. It was so minimalistic. And from what I understand, it opened at Coconut Grove Playhouse. It had the famous actors who became stars on Broadway, but it closed after a week. So I don't know what that says about Miami. But then they didn't want to pay for it? Yeah. Oh, they weren't ready for it. Probably not. It was a little too. It's kind of amazing when you think about that. And apparently, looking at the story further, back in Europe, Beckett was Irish, but he lived in France, and that's where James Joyce had lived for a long time. And it was first performed on the radio in France, and then somebody in a prison in Germany heard it, and that prisoner got permission from Beckett to perform it in the prison, and that was like the first main performance in Europe. Then it went to London. Nobody could stand it, and they walked out. But the London Times gave it a great review, and everybody, oh, this must be great. So, the rest is history. Anyway, I got a little off track there, but the point was that book, the Blue Cliff Record, yes, that's the one I'm obsessed with now. And I used to hate the Blue Cliff Record. A translation came out in 1977 when I was in graduate school, and at that time I was studying classical Chinese, and I was trying to, read this stuff, and I at that time I couldn't really. Even with the translation, I couldn't really, make sense enough out of the original classical Chinese. It was so dense. I could read some other things, but it was just crazy. And I put it aside, and I thought, oh, this is too much. But in recent years, and I've been looking at it, kind of word by word, and that's the one. But then I realized, hey, that's just. That's the one I'm obsessed with, and I have to say, sometimes I look at it, I said I can't believe I probably read this same poem that's in it or this comment that's in it dozens of times. I'm beginning to understand it now for the first time. So I think it has these stories have that quality, and that's what makes them fascinating today.
All right, folks. Well, then, if there are no more questions, a reminder for our internet audience watching at home, there's still time to call the number on the screen, purchase a copy of the book. We will get that signed for you, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Also, a reminder that all of our live streamed events are archived. So if you don't get to watch it live or you'd like to watch it a second time, you just go to the Books and Books website, go to the link to the live streaming, and any author appearance that we've broadcast from here at the store will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the store, we have Zen Koans as well as some of Dr. Heine's previous titles for sale at the counter over there. Once again, he's going to be signing over on the east side of the store. So buy a book, head over to the east to have Dr. Heine sign it for you, and please let's give a hand to Dr. Stephen Heine. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you, Doctor.